Just want to say good morning, good afternoon to my early birds. Thanks for being on. We're going to start promptly at 1 p.m. So we got about 7 more minutes to let everybody else trickle in. But again, thanks for being on. And Michelle, if you're there, would you be able to tell me, is the screen sharing working properly? And can you hear me? Oh, Yolanda, thank you. Appreciate the thumbs up. All right, great. I'm going to take care of the last couple of things myself, but we will start promptly at 1 p.m. Thanks both for being here.
Sorry, Chris. I'm sorry. I was on the phone with the state attorney's office, so I had shut everything off so I wasn't interrupting.
No worries. No worries. Thanks.
But yes, the screen sharing is working. Yes.
Perfect. I am loving all the note-taking apps popping up. Yes. Uh, yes, please feel free to take notes. The meeting is going to be recorded as well. So I will send a link out to all the participants if you'd like to download the video and share it with your agency or anyone else. By all means, do so. All right, we're coming up on 1 o'clock right now. I know we had a few more who responded to come, so just going to give them another minute or so, and we will get started. Thank you all for being here on time. Appreciate it. Making sure I take care of my very loud AC before we get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is going to be 97% 4 Pillars of ERPO Responsibility. For those who aren't familiar, 97% is a nonprofit organization focused on bringing gun owners into the conversation about effective gun policy and including them in building those solutions. My role with 97% is as their lead training strategist. I've a little bit about me. So my name is Christopher Corida. I'm a national expert in violence prevention, behavioral threat assessment, and extreme risk protection orders. I earned my Master of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg, as a Bloomberg American Health Initiative Fellow. I'm a retired detective from South Florida, where I was a hostage negotiator and a detective with our threat response unit for 20 years. I'm a contributor to Johns Hopkins national guidelines on ERPO implementation, and I'm a former master trainer for DHS's National Threat Assessment and Reporting Program. So before we go into our learning objectives for today, just some housekeeping. If anybody has any questions as we go through, please feel free to post them in the chat. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Oh, if we're going to mute. There we go. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I will save time and I will stay on after the presentation for as long as anyone would like to address any concerns that they may have. But again, please feel free to post the questions in the chat, because if I see them and they're pertinent, and I think it's worthwhile for everybody else, I'll try to address them in real time as well. So for our learning objections, we're going to start off by defining the 4 pillars of ERPO responsibility, talking about assigning clear responsibility for every phase of the ERPO process. We're going to see how behavioral threat assessment and management really builds that framework, really helps us define who should be responsible for those aspects. We're going to talk about 3 specific agencies and how, based on their resources, their location, their state law, they've addressed these 4 responsibilities, and some of the advantages and shortfalls that come with each of those choices. Everything is a trade-off. And finally, we're going to talk about a new 5-point framework that you can apply for your agency to help develop a more effective and responsive ERPO policy based on your specific framework in your state, your specific resources at your agency, and the community needs. So first, let's talk a little bit about why implementation matters, right? So nationally, ERPO is often talked about as a uniform law. And the reality is ERPO laws are written into statute, but they live and die in the field. How an agency uses the ERPO law that they have in their state is really what dictates the end result, the outcomes. No two ERPO programs look alike within a state or even within the same county. Broward County is an excellent example of that, my home county, where City of Fort Lauderdale has a very different policy than Broward Sheriff's Office, Pembroke Pines. Every agency has made specific choices about how they implement their ERPO program, how they use the tool. And that's the same we're seeing across the country. And what we find, and we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, is that's as it should be. We're going to how an agency assigns those 4 pillars of responsibility, how you define who is responsible at each stage is going to affect your outcomes. And it's a choice and a balancing act that every agency has to face, of casting a wide net versus having specific, well-trained officers who are able to handle these cases once they're identified. Today's session is going to use three real agencies as models to show different approaches to striking that balance. So first, before we go into this, I want to emphasize that behavioral threat assessment management is the foundation for these 4 pillars. When you look at ERPO as just a tool, really it becomes it risks becoming a rubber stamp. It risks becoming just something where we're going through the motions. We complete our ERPO petition, we serve it, and we forget about that case and move on. And that becomes problematic because at the end of the day, we still have someone in crisis and we still have issues and concerns that we need to continue to address. So behavioral threat assessment and management gives us a foundation for doing just that. The four pillars of behavioral threat assessment and management are identification of the threat. You want to assess that threat. You're constantly evaluating as you gather more information, and you're constantly taking in the totality of the circumstances to decide how you're then going to mitigate that threat. Mitigation is the actual action we take to interrupt a threat, to safeguard. It could be anything from mitigation could be anything from target hardening, so having extra officers or personnel at a particular location where we've received a threat, all the way to connect. If we've identified the subject, mitigation could look like connecting that subject to services, or in some cases even arrest if we have criminal charges. And then management is the long-term case management. Once we've mitigated the initial threat, we still have this person of concern in the world. What are we doing? What resources are we bringing together? What partnerships are we leaning on to now manage this person of concern and get them to a place where they are no longer a threat of violence? And something else to keep in mind as we consider behavioral threat assessment, what it is and what it isn't. Many of you, especially in the public health field, may be familiar, and especially in domestic violence, may be familiar with violence risk assessment. So a violence risk assessment is a static process. So it relies on historical and demographic factors. It focuses on the psychology profiles and past incidents of an individual. And the concern with that in terms of operational choices is when you rely entirely on a violence risk assessment, it can introduce bias. And let me explain what I mean by that. So violence risk assessments, the most common that most of you may be familiar with, even if you're not involved with them yourself, there are hospital programs, where hospital violence interruption programs, where every person who has been a victim of violent trauma goes through a triage process. And based on that assessment, based on that violence risk assessment, they may be connected to services. Some of those violence risk factors may be their race, their economic status, because on a population level, we're checking off boxes, and on a population level, those are indications that this person may be at higher risk for violence. Now, a violence risk assessment in a hospital setting, when you're trying to connect people to services, if you misidentify somebody and the program simply offers them services, there's no negative outcome. They may just decline the services and that's that. When you're talking about interventions where we may be curtailing someone's ability to own a firearm, where we may be assessing an arrest, we can't be using those static factors. We need to focus on observable concerning behaviors. And that's the difference between a violence risk assessment, which is static, and behavioral threat assessment, which is always evolving based on the information we're taking in. It tracks the behavioral patterns, indicating a pathway to violence. It minimizes demographic violence by focusing on observable behaviors, not someone's race, someone's gender. It enables ongoing reassessment. Every time you get new information, every time you learn of new behaviors or new history, you can reassess and change your mitigation and management strategy. And again, behavioral threat assessment is dynamic, and it's best for assessing specific cases for targeted intervention. So if you want to think about this, BTAM is the engine in every one of these 4 pillars, right? Pillar 1 is to identify the threat, right? Frontline officers need to be trained to recognize the warning signs in the community. Then someone needs to be assigned to investigate this situation and potentially complete an ERPO petition. Then there's Pillar 3, service and dispossession. So BTAM trained officers can de-escalate more effectively with fewer high-risk encounters at that door. And Pillar 4, case management. If you're trained in behavioral threat assessment management, you're going to better be able to identify the cases that need constant check-in versus the ones that we can build up community support around this person, and we as law enforcement can take a step back and allow another agency or another organization to take lead on long-term management. But overall, what the important thing to keep in mind is ERPOs without behavioral threat assessment are really just paperwork. It's one step. Behavioral threat assessment and management without ERPOs and intervention are just observation. Together, they create an intervention. So to cover again the 4 pillars of ERPO implementation, the 4 areas of responsibility that every agency needs to clearly define. First is identify ERPO cases. Who is responsible to recognize when an ERPO may be needed? Number 2, investigation and petition. Once that case is identified, who is responsible to investigate, build the case, and complete the petition and court process? Number 3 is service and dispossession. So once you've received your petition, who is going to be responsible to go back to the respondent, serve the order, and dispossess them of their firearms? And finally, number 4, case management. Once the order is served and firearms are recovered, who is going to be responsible to manage this case long term and revisit it to consider renewal or consider allowing the ERPO to expire? So we're going to look at 3 specific agencies and how they've built their policy around these 4 pillars, these 4 responsibilities, and we're going to see slightly differing approaches, and we're going to start to see how the ERPO law in each state and the politics around ERPO can often lead those implementation decisions. So the first is Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. They have a robust resource-heavy model where they've bifurcated to lesser threats and targeted violence threats, and both of those specialized units are empowered to utilize ERPO. And then they also have embedded clinicians that work with both of those sets of units and continue to help manage and mitigate these cases. Denver Police Department has one centralized ERPO unit, so patrol is responsible for identifying the cases and then forwarding it to this specific unit. And then Broward Sheriff's Office casts the widest net. Any deputy in Broward County is allowed to, by policy, is allowed to petition for an ERPO. They don't have to go through the Detective Bureau. There is a specialized unit that investigates more concerning cases of targeted violence or greater threats, especially at schools. However, any deputy on the road can start the petition process, send it to their legal unit, and see it through. And we're going to get into each of these a little deeper. So what does each pillar require? The first pillar is identifying ERPO cases, right? So frontline personnel who recognize the warning signs of dangerousness, suicidality, or targeted violence. They need a clear referral pathway when a case may warrant an ERPO. So if the person who is identifying the ERPO case is not the one to then follow through and petition, they need to have a clear pathway as to who they need to call and how that notification is going to occur. And then finally, they need training and cultural buy-in so identification can actually happen. And what I mean by cultural buy-in is our schools need to understand what our goals are and what types of behavior they need to contact us for. Parents, large organizations, if we have, especially in some of our smaller towns, we may have one or two businesses that really drive the town. Building relationships with organizational leadership at those businesses is also important because they're going to see things before law enforcement does. They're going to be able to identify behaviors before we can and refer them to us. So again, identification is a behavioral threat assessment management skill. So patrol needs to learn what behaviors indicate elevated threat. What is an explicit threat versus what may be a passing threat. They need to identify reckless use or display of firearms. They need to understand what collateral information is important when a family member in passing mentions a previous incident. They need to understand that those are also important factors to consider today, whether an ERPO is appropriate today. They need to understand behavioral change. So was there a specific incident that sparked this specific behavior and this is completely out of character for this person? Or is this part of a series or a pattern of behavior that is of concern? And then also they need to recognize recent acquisition or access to firearms. These are, when it comes to extreme risk protection orders or RPOs here in Florida, really what we're looking for is a combination of dangerous behavior and ready access to firearms. It's those two pieces that we need to train our frontline officers, the patrol officers, to identify. So how does PBSO do it? How does Palm Beach do it? Well, patrol and all county agencies act as the primary intake for Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. So Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office set up their behavioral unit initially with the aid of DOJ money. So they received a large grant to set up their program. I believe they've since gone independent of DOJ. But what they've done is not only have they made it where their own sheriffs throughout the county identify cases and forward them to their behavioral unit, but they've made it clear to all of the agencies within the county, all the city agencies and municipal agencies, Boca Raton, West Palm Beach, any case that they identify that may require a risk protection order or may be indicative of targeted violence, they will adopt the case. They've realized that they have the resources to take these on, and they've decided to take a role as an aid to all of their neighboring agencies. So in this case, road deputies are tasked with identifying the cases of crisis, and once the case is identified, it's referred to the behavioral management unit for specialized handling and petition. For Denver PD, they also have patrol identifying these cases. So Denver is independent. Denver is both the city and the county seat, but they also have neighboring agencies that they have to cooperate with. Denver PD has their patrol trained to identify cases and then forward them directly to a single ERPO unit. So all ERPOs in the city of Denver have to be done by their policy, have to be done by their trained ERPO unit. So it's a team of detectives and a sergeant. Patrol does more triage than PBSO, acting as the gate, not the gatekeeper. So where PBSO has a broader net where any concerning behavior can go to this larger investigative unit, and that investigative unit can then bifurcate lesser threats and more serious threats and independently decide on ERPO. Denver PD, patrol is really just looking for ERPO. If it is an ERPO case, it goes to the ERPO unit. So that could be suicidal cases, domestic cases, cases of targeted violence. And then finally, Broward Sheriff's Office casts a very wide net. Any deputy, road on the road or otherwise, can identify a case and serve as the petitioner. They don't have to refer the case elsewhere, but so every every deputy or detective in Broward Sheriff's Office is empowered to identify these cases and then take that case on all the way through. In cases where there is a threat of targeted violence, so a threat at our schools or a threat of mass violence at a business or public space, those cases would be referred to the threat management unit that can also do the risk protection order. However, any deputy can take this case and own it from the beginning and own the investigation. So again, thinking about that wider net versus the narrower funnel. For Broward Sheriff's Office, where any deputy can initiate the ERPO process, you're going to get more ERPO cases. You're going to have more cases identified. You're empowering more deputies to make the decision in the field and start the process right then and there. So you're going to necessarily get more cases. The benefit of that is you're less likely to miss a case. You're less likely to miss an opportunity where an ERPO would be beneficial. The downside of that is you run the risk of having weaker petitions forwarded up to your legal unit and weaker petitions going forward to the courts. So you run a higher risk of having ERPOs denied, as opposed to if you had more triage in the other two, for PBSO and for Denver. You have more triage, you have more assessment going on at the street level before it's referred to the investigating detectives, and then those detectives are making the final decision as to whether or not an ERPO or other intervention is most appropriate. So again, pillar 2, investigation and ERPO petition. So this involves the investigative depth, right? When we're considering an ERPO, it's not just the initial incident, but we want to consider their history, all the other elements that are listed in your statute. So you have, reckless use of firearms, recent acquisition of firearms, serious mental illness or substance use, violent history, violation of previous orders. This requires investigation. This requires access to records. Some agencies allow their entire department to access all these records. Some agencies have certain records only available to investigative units. So that's something to consider. Along with the investigation and ERPO petition is the ability to take the observed concerning behavior and translate that into the language of the statute, so that a judge reading the petition understands how the behavior connects to what they're allowed to consider, and we have effective petitions that are more likely to be approved. Also, if you have a specialized unit who handles all of these investigations, you're going to build up speed. They're going to be able to move through these investigations more quickly. It's like any skill. It's sets and reps. If you have one specialized unit that's handling all these cases, they're going to get very good at it. This is going to be streamlined. And when it comes to an ERPO investigation or any threat of mass violence, speed is of the essence. A fast and effective response is our best chance at mitigating a potential tragedy. So again, as you're thinking about your petition, you want officers and deputies and detectives who are going to be able to differentiate between transient threats versus substantive threats. This all goes to behavioral threat assessment management training, which is extremely valuable for any agency, for any officer or deputy who is responsible for the ERPOs for their particular unit or their particular community. So coming back to PBSO, once the case is identified and forwarded to the behavioral management unit, they actually have a bifurcated system. They have mental health detectives. So cases where the threat of violence is a threat of self-inflicted violence, a suicidal threat, or cases where there's an obvious diagnosable mental illness. They have detectives who are cross-trained to identify and manage mental health cases that work with embedded clinicians within this unit. When there's a case with a more serious threat, a threat of targeted violence, their TVU, their targeted violence unit, will take that case. But the beauty of this program that they have at Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office is both of those units are housed under the same umbrella. So when a case is referred to the behavioral management unit, it may start as a suicidal threat, and then as that investigation progresses, they find that this person is actually making threats to bring a gun to work. They're making threats against others. So that case can very quickly and easily be moved from one of those units to the other and back again. If it's originally referred to the targeted violence unit, and they find that was a transient threat, and really this is just a mental health case, and this person needs management and assistance, it can be referred down. So having both of those under the same umbrella necessitates fewer handoffs, and it results in fewer cases being dropped. Additionally, those embedded clinicians work with both. So the same clinicians work with the mental health detectives, and they work with the targeted violence unit. So they're helping assess those cases, and they're helping manage which detectives are most appropriate to be handling the case. For Denver PD, the ERPO unit handles assessment, petition, service, and follow-up for every case. So once patrol has identified the case, a team of specially trained officers and detectives and a sergeant handle all the ERPO cases from start to finish from that point on. To date, Denver PD has not had a single ERPO petition denied. They average, last I spoke with them, they average between 60 and 80 a year. And those are pretty good numbers. For a city that size and for the number of cases they handle, they're more selective about when they utilize an extreme risk protection order. But they also have partnerships with other social supports. So even if they're not using an extreme risk protection order, they are still connecting the subject to services. They're still leaning on community partnerships to continue to manage this case. And they will revisit a case from time to time. The challenge with Denver PD is facing right now is that they have a separate targeted violence and terrorism unit. So most agencies, most of a certain size, after 9/11, assigned JTTF officers. All right, agencies started signing task force officers, TFOs, to work with the FBI and to work with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and that continued on. Here in Florida, after the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting, some agencies created a new responsibility for those JTTF connected officers to handle ERPO cases. Some agencies created separate pipelines, and going back to Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, they recognized the connection between those cases, and they made sure that all those threat cases came to one umbrella and could be handled appropriately. It's a challenge to reshuffle what we already have. Denver PD has done a really good job with their ERPO unit, but the one friction that they're having is that when a case may require a risk protection order and contains threats of mass violence, there's a little bit of a back and forth as to who should be handling the case, because those two units are housed under two different chains of command. And then finally, for BSO investigation and petition, when BSO implemented their ERPO program, they responded by greatly expanding their legal unit. So because all of their deputies are empowered to apply for a risk protection order, they recognize the need for more legal assistance to draft those petitions and to assist their officers, their deputies. So they expanded their legal unit. They hired 10 new attorneys to help manage these incoming petitions and file them with the courts. The originating deputy is typically the investigator and the petitioner, and works with their legal counsel. Again, the threat management unit, who also have embedded clinicians, handle cases where there's a threat of targeted violence or mass violence. Every case includes thorough internal review. So their legal unit does a really good job of reviewing every ERPO before it gets petitioned. So there is an extra safeguard against weak or unsubstantiated petitions going through, but they do have tremendous volume that they're managing. So again, when it comes to deciding who should investigate and petition for the ERPO, specialization is a huge benefit. When you have, you're going to get higher petition quality and higher approval rates. You're going to build deep institutional knowledge over time. Again, sets and reps. If you have the same people handling these investigations, they're going to know the best ways to manage them. And then the one downside is there's a single point of failure if the unit saturates or turns over. So if you have all of your ERPOs going to one small group and you have a sudden turnover in that group where you lose that institutional knowledge all at once, you have a challenge there. So spreading that knowledge across a larger breadth, as BSO does, has its advantages. And again, your diagnostic questions, the things you want to consider is who owns the affidavit, how experienced are they, and what is your denial or grant rate, right? What does it reveal about the petition you're getting? If you're seeing that you're getting more and more of your petitions denied, it may be time to reevaluate your policy and see who is in charge. It may be time to consider having training a specialized unit, or even depending on the size of your agency, one or two officers or detectives or deputies to handle your cases. Okay, pillar 3 is petition service and firearm dispossession. So you want a coordinated and tactically sound approach when you are serving this petition. Firearm recovery, inventory, and secure storage following consistent protocols. You want to make sure you know who is recovering the firearms, how they're cataloging them according to your own evidence procedures, and then full documentation, evidence chain, who's entering them into NCIC, FCIC, if appropriate, and any dealer notifications. So the central decision here is, does the investigative team serve the order, or does a separate unit do it? Again, having behavioral threat assessment management trained officers handling these cases and handling the service is also extremely valuable. They're gonna, by the time they're serving the order, they'll have a pretty good picture of the subject's risk factors, their triggers. They're going to know how to de-escalate a situation. Hopefully, they've already built a rapport with the subject, and they're gonna be able to facilitate a pretty smooth service. So how does PBSO do it? Whichever subunit in Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, whichever subunit detective petitions for the ERPO, they will also go to serve the ERPO. They may have their civil service unit respond with them, but the officer who investigated the case, who's already had contact with the subject and who already has a rapport, they are going to be the ones to go and be lead on service, and they'll bring any assistance that they may or may not need. Also, they will very often bring their embedded clinicians with them at the time of service. This facilitates a warm handoff to services. So as somebody's being served with a risk protection order and it's being explained, hey, your family was very concerned about you. You were exhibiting this behavior and this behavior, and the concern was that you had firearms in the house, and nobody wants to see you hurt yourself or anyone else. So our job today is to secure your firearms. I also want to introduce Dr. So-and-so. She is a clinician that works with our unit. If you're willing, she would love to talk to you and see if there's any other need that we can help connect you with, so that you can get to a place where you're okay and that you're safe to have your firearms again. And having that give and take, having that warm handoff, having that clear connection to services at the time of dispossession does so much to de-escalate those situations. So this is a really strong framework. Denver PD, again, the same ERPO unit the same ERPO unit that investigated the case, petitioned for the ERPO, are also the ones who are going to go out and serve the order. Again, this has the benefit of the same person who initiated the investigation and has probably already spoken to the respondent, spoken to witnesses, and built a rapport. They are the ones responding out to serve the ERPO. Again, the benefits of that are fairly obvious. They already know what to expect. Hopefully the respondent already has an idea of what's going on, and this is not a huge surprise, and it facilitates a much smoother service. Broward Sheriff's Office takes a different approach. They're a huge agency. They have a huge volume of risk protection orders, and they allow patrol to petition for the orders themselves. So any order that patrol petitions for goes to the legal unit, gets filed with the courts. If it's approved, their civil service unit goes out independently to serve the risk protection order. This is a great approach for scale, but the drawbacks are obvious, right? So if you have a civil service unit serving the order, and they're not the ones who investigated the case initially, and they don't have a full picture, if those packets are not detailed, and that deputy doesn't have all the information they need to make sure that they don't hit the wrong buttons, say the wrong things, that can create friction. However, the benefit to scale is obvious. If you have all of your patrol officers empowered to file a risk protection order, you need a better mechanism to serve those orders, and you can't tie up all of your patrol units on the rest of this process. You need to split those responsibilities. So again, thinking about integrated service versus specialized civil service, if it's the same person who investigated the case, who built a rapport, who knows your subject, if that's the person who is serving the order, there are obvious benefits. You do want to make sure they're well trained tactically and in de-escalation. Our unit always had a hostage negotiator on the team. I find that as we train across the country, the folks who are best at serving these orders are often CIT or negotiator trained. They're the ones who can talk to anybody, those folks. That's who you want there. Having a specialized service unit, the benefit to that there can also be benefits to that. The benefit is to scaling. Also, there may be a benefit to separating the service and the dispossession from the officer who did the investigation. The civil service unit is just doing their job and taking their firearms. The detective can come back in, connect the person to services, and they may not be seen as much as the person who confiscated their firearms. So having that separation, if it's done properly and with good communication, it can be used to your advantage as well. But again, there are trade-offs, benefits, and risks to either one of these approaches. And then finally, case management. This is probably the most overlooked part of ERPO programs that I've seen as we've trained across the country. More and more agencies are doing a better job of identifying when to use an ERPO. They're doing stronger investigations. They're improving their approval rate. But once the ERPO is served and the initial concern is resolved, many agencies are still letting that fall to the wayside. There's not follow-up. There's not a plan for how to continue to mitigate the behaviors that this person of concern was demonstrating. So again, case management is pathway disruption, right? If we have somebody who made a threat to bring a firearm to their place of business because they have a grievance against their boss, right? We took their firearms away. We put them on notice that we're paying attention, that we're watching them, that we're not going to allow that to happen. That is a great first step. But if we leave and we do not do anything else to mitigate this person's anger, to mitigate this person's grievance, to connect them to services, to help them to cope with the crisis that brought them here in the first place, we're going to see this person reemerge as a problem again. Just as an aside, my partner with Fort Lauderdale Police Department, so my first partner in our threat response unit, he went to training. He was He just retired. He's okay. What about he was our SWAT team leader, trained our SWAT team for the last 10 years, 32 years of service. 2 years ago, he responded to a barricaded subject, armed subject at Holiday Inn here, about 5 blocks from my house. 32 years on, didn't care. He's still first at the door. He can't help himself. So there he is. He's at the door, calls the subject to the door. He wasn't answering the phone, wasn't cooperating. When the subject came to the door, he had a firearm in hand. They exchanged gunfire. Jack took 2 rounds to his vest. He took 1 round through his arm. He's okay. But what we learned is that the subject who had shot Jack, Jack won the day. The subject is no longer with us. But the takeaway, what we learned was that a neighboring agency actually had a risk protection order on this subject from about a year and a half earlier. It stemmed from a combination of substance use, mental illness, and violence, domestic violence. His wife was the initial caller. He was a repeat customer of the local police department, and they got a risk protection order. Well, when it came time for renewal, his wife called the agency and explained, "Hey, he's still calling. He's still making threats to me. I'm really afraid for me and my kids. I need you to do something." And their response was to say, "Well, then you need to get a domestic order because we don't have it. We don't have enough to renew." The order expired. He received his firearm back, and that's the firearm that he shot my friend with. So when I say that management is extremely important, it's not just important for to check a box or for liability purposes. Management is going to keep your people safe. Managing these cases when we identify them, not letting them fall to the wayside because we got overwhelmed or we got sick of dealing with someone. We really need to keep these cases seriously, because if we do it and we do it right the first time, that's one more cop who's going to be safe when they go to the door next time. That's one more person who's going to be safe the next time they deal with this subject, because guns are no longer part of the equation, right? So when I talk about management, it really hits home. It's extremely important that once we identify somebody who is of concern, who has firearms, who's making threats against himself or making threats against the public, that we take that seriously and we use all the tools we have available when we can. So coming back to our cases, Palm Beach Sheriff's Office, pretty straightforward. They manage the cases all the way through. Their clinicians help the detectives and the mental health officers create a management plan, whether that's weekly check-ins at first, moving to monthly, or moving to 3 months. Together with their clinicians, they create a management plan. The clinicians help manage those contacts. They report what they find back to the officers. If there's more interventions that need to happen, those officers may need to go knock on the door and pay a visit, but a management plan is created for every subject. Oh, and with that management plan at the end of the year, they already have a clear picture as to whether or not an ERPO needs to be renewed or it can be allowed to expire. They don't need to reinvestigate the case. They've already been investigating the case and managing that case as the year goes. Denver PD is very similar. They don't have the extra assistance of clinicians, although from what I understand, they're looking into building a co-responder or a co-responder model, or partnering with a community mental health organization to help with that. But their unit continues to monitor and reassess. Again, every time they have an ERPO case, that specialty unit creates a management plan. They decide how often they need to check in. They have protocols for running background checks on all their active ERPO subjects. And by the time a decision needs to be made about renewal, they already have a clear picture as to whether or not they're going to renew. BSO is a little more challenging, right? So think about that. If patrol officers are, if a patrol officer is the petitioning officer for an ERPO, they don't have the capacity to continue to case manage. That's why we have detective bureaus. That's why we have long-term investigators. So when a patrol officer investigates a case, it goes to the legal unit. There are some automated background checks. There are some automated things that happen, but nobody is really assigned to go and knock on that door or double check on them. The clinicians within their threat management unit may also follow up, but if the subject is not responsive, that may end the follow-up as far as the deputies' cases go. Any case that's referred to the threat management unit, there's much more robust management built in. Again, just like PBSO and Denver, they build a plan, they follow up on their cases, they follow up on their subjects, and they make a strong decision one way or the other as far as renewal at the end of the year. So again, specialized case ownership, it keeps high risk cases under the spotlight. It builds continuity of clinical and legal relationships with the respondent. But it may starve lower risk cases of need of attention. So just like with BSO, if we have lower risk cases, we have to triage. We have to triage based on our resources. But under these models, if you have a specialized unit, they're necessarily going to have to triage and decide on which cases require follow-up and which cases do not. Tiered or rotated management spreads the workload across the agency more sustainably. It's easier to scale, but it's harder to deepen the quality. So again, with PBSO, to train everybody to write an effective ERPO every single time is a difficult task. So with that, you risk inconsistent follow-up. So again, your question for your agency as you go back is, who decides whether or not to renew? What's the process for collecting the information to make that decision? Do you have a written renewal framework, and how do you re-engage with families or other connections around your subject before you make that final decision? So you can just kind of step back and look at this. So for identifying, PBSO has their road deputies identify the cases. For the investigation and petition, they have a bifurcated model where lesser threats are handled by one part of the unit, more serious or criminally parallel threats are handled by another, but they're all under one house, so the referrals can go back and forth, and there's less of a chance of a dropped handoff. For service and dispossession, it's the same subunit that whichever detective files the ERPO is the one who's going to serve it. And then case management all again stays in-house with a robust level of personnel to manage their caseload for the entire county. Denver PD has a tighter triage, right? Patrol is identifying cases for ERPO. So with PBSO, Patrol's job is to identify cases where there's behavioral threat, where there's where there is a concern for escalated violence, and then their BMU triages from there. They have a lesser threshold for making the referral because they have a lower tier and an upper tier. Denver PD, the police department has a higher bar before they're going to refer to their ERPO unit. They basically already have to decide that we have the elements for an ERPO before we refer to the unit. So we have a tighter triage, and then within that, you have centralized ERPO unit that handles the investigation. That same unit handles dispossession, and finally, that same unit is handling management. So once a case is identified, you have really strong, really focused work on the ERPO case. And finally, with BSO, any deputy can identify a case. Any deputy can start the ERPO process with assistance from their legal unit. Service goes to a dedicated civil service unit unless it's a threat management case. They may serve their own. And then case management is tiered by case sensitivity. Not every case is going to get the same level of management and monitoring as every other because of the sheer number of ERPOs that they're doing. So again, going back to that synergy of BTAM and ERPO, BTAM gives you accurate identification of high-risk individuals. If you are trained on identifying the specific behaviors that indicate elevated risk, you're going to do a better job of identifying the cases that are going to need an ERPO. BTAM, by its framework, necessitates rapid mitigation. As soon as you identify that you have a legitimate threat or a legitimate concern, the under the BTAM framework, you are called to action. This is not a identify and observe. This is a identify and mitigate. You're always looking for what tool is going to reduce risk every step along the way. BTAM also calls for collaboration. It's an interdisciplinary approach. So ERPO in many states is a law enforcement tool only, and many more, maybe law enforcement, family members, clinicians. But the assessment management and the successful use of ERPO in your community, in your city, is going to depend on collaboration. It's going to depend on you being able to rely on other community organizations to support what you're trying to do, and you supporting them in what they're trying to do. And again, BTAM gives you a framework for documentation. It gives you a language. It gives you clear definitions. The way I like to explain this when we do our training is every officer in their career has walked into a call, and as they're leaving the call, every hair on the back of their neck is standing up, and they know that they wish that there was more they could have done. They know that this is going to get worse. But they can't quite put their finger on how to explain that. Why is there something wrong here, but not on this case? And BTAM gives you a language to explain those behaviors, to identify those behaviors as real risk behaviors. And that's going to strengthen your documentation. That's going to strengthen your ERPO petition. That's going to strengthen your response. And it's going to lower the likelihood that you're going to have a recurring problem because you're going to address it properly the first time. So if we zoom out, if we take a step back for a second, I present these three models, and it's very easy to plug and play, right? It's very easy to say, hey, I like that model. Let me just take that model and I'm going to plug it into my agency. And that's a normal impulse. We have a lot on our plate. But to be as effective as we can be, we need to understand our local context, right? So the right model depends on your statute, your geography. So if you're in Florida, Denver's policy may not make the most sense. If you're in Massachusetts, policy from an agency in New Jersey isn't going to make sense to you, for your agency. You're going to have to take a look at your local statute, your geography, your political environment, in the existing infrastructure within your agency and community. What resources do you actually have that you can dedicate to this process? We're going to be releasing a new white paper in the following weeks that's going to address us and articulate a specific framework that you can use to analyze your current policy and see where you can strengthen it. You may be dedicating a lot of resources, but they're being dedicated to something that is not as needed. And if you reassess what the needs are in your community, in your agency, you may be able to do more with what you already have. The paper is titled "ERPO's Function as Distinct Context-Specific Firearm Violence Prevention Tools," and it's a comparative analysis. It was a peer-reviewed paper. I co-authored it with Tara Rose, and that's going to be releasing at the end of this month. I can keep everybody abreast on when that's out. So about the author, my co-author on this is Tara Rose. She takes a violence policy approach focusing on resilience and social capital as a means to improve outcomes. And what social capital means is exactly what it sounds like. What connections do we have? So within a community, the number of connections and resources and folks that any one person can call and rely upon, the more of those folks they have, the stronger they're going to be, and the less likely that they're going to have poor outcomes due to violence. The same holds true for us as law enforcement or as any organization, whether we're clinicians tasked with mitigating these violent acts, whether we're law enforcement officers, we're in hospitals. If we have the connections beforehand to call the people we need to call, the relationships to get things done when they need to get done, we're going to have better outcomes. That's social capital. That's people in the bank, money in the bank, right? That's the people we know that we can call and say, hey, I need this, and they're going to do it. And the same is true in reverse. If they call us and they need something, we know we're going to do that for them. That building that up is really the key to our strongest levels of implementation on ERPO or really any violence prevention policy. So that 5-point implementation framework, and again, as the paper comes out, you can learn more about it, but you want to look at your legal framework. Okay, so how is your state statute actually written? What are the existing regulatory frameworks? And just to take two off the top, Massachusetts has robust licensing and permitting laws and restrictions on which firearms are allowed in which places. They have a firearm confiscation law where local law enforcement in an emergency situation can simply cancel your permit and demand your firearms and then take you to a judge. That's outside of the ERPO process. So in a state like Massachusetts, they do very few ERPOs, but they also have some of the lowest gun violence in the country. They go back and forth with Connecticut every year with the lowest gun violence rates. Florida is a much more permissive state. We have far fewer barriers in the way of somebody purchasing or possessing a firearm. But we had a robust behavioral threat assessment and management program implemented in the wake of MSD. So while it is much easier and there are far fewer barriers to purchasing or possessing a firearm in the state of Florida, we have an extremely robust response when it comes to ERPO and it comes to mitigating when we do recognize that somebody is at risk. So, and for that reason, the state of Florida, despite our politics being relatively conservative, we actually do more ERPOs in the state of Florida than any other state in the country. So then you want to think about, so that's your regulatory ecosystem. What laws already exist and how does ERPO fit into that? Is ERPO always the best tool? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes understanding what your other laws are and what your other tools are, one of those tools is the more appropriate tool. Then you have your implementation infrastructure. What resources do you have? What training is available outside of your organization? What knowledge do you have within your organization? Who's the person who has figured out the best way to do ERPO? If you're a lieutenant, if you're a captain, pull that person into the office. Hey, I noticed in the last year, we've done 12 ERPOs and you did 10 of them. Can you talk to me about how that went? What are you doing? Learn from them and then see what you can apply more broadly to improve implementation across your agency. Then there's political and cultural context. What does your community actually want? What are the concerns? In rural Minnesota, the concern is suicide, as it should be. The suicide numbers in the rural parts of our country are still going up, while gun violence generally, interpersonal violence, is dropping. So how does that factor into where you want your focus and how you want to utilize ERPO in your community? And then geographic disparities. In Broward County alone, we noticed through geospatial analysis that where we're having our highest concentrations of gun violence are completely different areas than where we're utilizing ERPO most often. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What are we missing opportunities to use ERPO in places where it can do more good? These are all questions that you in your agency can ask of your own policy and start to work out where you want your policy to go from here. So again, as you look at your agency and you look at those 5 pillars, you want to think about where's your weakest pillar, what are the constraining dimensions, and what's the best of the models that you've heard today or other successful models, because there are very small agencies that have managed to train 1 or 2 officers that are then the expert to assist every other officer as they identify an ERPO. That's another model. We have one agency in Central Florida where one sergeant manages all the ERPO cases, but the patrol officers, the deputies on the road, still own the case from start to finish. And that sergeant is in charge of making sure those deputies continue to follow up on those cases as the year goes and assist them in doing so. So there are a lot of ways to share those 4 pillars. There are a lot of ways to assign them. As long as your agency is clear on who is responsible to identify, who is responsible to investigate and petition, who is responsible to serve the petition and dispossess the firearms, and who is responsible for management long-term, as long as you have those 4 covered, there's no wrong way to do this. And you just want to always be reassessing. What are we doing well? What could we do better? how can we do that with the resources available? And again, who in your agency needs training, right? This is another thing to consider. Your patrol, across the board, you need patrol to be able to identify when an ERPO may be appropriate. If you have investigators, getting them more in-depth behavioral threat assessment management training can be extremely valuable. Again, as we discussed in the presentation, in building stronger petitions and doing a better job identifying concerning behaviors, you're going to do a better job of mitigating all the issues that you see in a case. Your legal counsel, if you have a legal counsel who is assisting in the petitions, which most agencies do, you want to make sure they get additional training on this. Most police legal assist, most police legal counsel have some experience in protection orders through domestic orders and previous orders that pre-existed ERPO. However, it's always a good idea for your legal counsel that's in charge of this to get additional training, whether that's in behavioral threat assessment, additional ERPO training, or both. This is outside of probably most of your control, but judges having strong training and understanding their role in assessing a threat and issuing an ERPO is also extremely important. And then clinicians, having your clinicians understand the difference, be trained in threat assessment and risk assessment versus diagnosis, right? And that's a different practice, that's a different discipline. And having them cross-train with your officers, train in the same room. You're going to have different perspectives, different ideas. Getting those folks in the same room together and training together is going to expand both of their perspectives. It's going to make them all better at what they do. So, ERPO Collaborate, when you leave here today, I implore you to learn who the decision makers are at every agency and organization that you're going to work with today, this week, before you need them, before the next case hits. What local organization provides clinical services at free or reduced costs, right? What youth organizations are available to help with wayward children? Which school programs are available? Which businesses offer EAP and intervention services? Those larger organizations can be a huge resource in your cases. Make those partnerships today, make those connections today. Your local hospitals, risk management, that's a huge one. Establish relationships with community resources and stakeholders before you need them. And remember, MOUs are great, but they're not needed. You don't need an MOU. You need a relationship. You need your detectives, your deputies, your personnel who are handling these cases to be able to pick up a phone, get the resources they need from a neighboring organization, and you need them to be available to those organizations when they need your assistance. Building those relationships today is going to save you hours, if not days, in your investigations in the future. Okay, and key takeaways. So you have your 4 pillars. Again, behavioral threat assessment is what builds this framework. It's all built on behavioral threat assessment, right? You need a framework for investigating risk versus probable cause, and BTAM does that. You have 3 viable models to start with. There are many agencies doing this many different ways. No one of them is wrong as long as they are covering those 4 responsibilities clearly and they're continuing to reassess and improve. And again, if you want to calibrate your agency and figure out where you can improve your policy and your approach, we'll be releasing our 5-point framework in the coming weeks to help with those implementation decisions. So again, ERPO without BTAM is paperwork. BTAM without ERPO is observation. Together, they make a very strong intervention. And just to build on that, within 97%, we offer training. So if you'd like to host training at your agency, please feel free to reach out to me. We have a 1-day Essentials for Law Enforcement. That's a great class for everyone in your agency, but it's a really good class for patrol to help them identify cases that may require an ERPO. We also have a 1-day ERPO petition writing workshop. Again, whoever in your agency is responsible for writing petitions, this is great for your officers, your legal counsel. And then we have a 3-day ERPO and behavioral threat assessment for threat investigations. That's our comprehensive deep dive for investigators, threat management unit members, and specialized units. If you have a co-responder model, having your clinicians and your officers trained together through this program is a great way to build relationships and to share to share their different perspectives in real time, going through real case studies. We actually have our next 3-day scheduled as an online class, June 16th to the 18th. It's going to be online via Zoom. My email is there, the website 97percenttraining.com if you'd like to look at our scheduled events. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. So we have a couple questions in the comments. So the first was from Detective Wigdorski. Have you heard of any ERPO unit being able to look up how many registered guns an individual owns in real time? We can only do pistol permits and handguns. We have no access to checks if an individual owns a registered rifle or shotgun. It would be nice to know the rifles and or shotguns the respondent. Yeah. So no, that's the bad news. So depending on your state, you're in Buffalo, correct? So state of New York, yes, handguns are all registered. Long guns do not need to be registered. So no, there is no clearinghouse. You can't search for guns in reverse. And there's federal law specifically dictating that cannot ever happen. If your state requires registration of your firearms, great. You have some resource. But no, there's no way to search a person to determine how many firearms they've purchased. If you have a case where you believe somebody recently purchased a firearm, if you contact your local ATF agents, they can run a check for recent purchases, but I believe it's within 3 days or a week of the purchase, those records are expunged. As if they passed a background check, within 7 days, those records are no longer available. But I would implore you to talk with your local ATF agents. They're going to have the best available resources as far as federal data, but it is limited, unfortunately. Let me see if we have any other questions, Jeff. Oh, no problem, Jeff. If anybody wants to come off camera, if you have any other questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few. Otherwise, I really appreciate all your time. If you have any questions for me, my email is up there, chris@97percent.us. Shoot me an email. I can talk to you more about our training, or if you have a specific issue that you're having, I'm happy to talk it through with you and see if I can help. If you are Florida-based and you're interested in joining our monthly, I run a Florida ERPO working group. You can email me at the same email if you would like to be added to that. It's a group of us that get together once a month. It's the third Tuesday of every month, and we kind of work through any of the problems that we're having with our particular cases, share training, and share information with one another. And that's been a really good resource and a really great way to kind of compare how we as individuals and as agencies are using risk protection orders. So if you're Florida-based, feel free to email me and reach out. If you're interested in starting a similar group in your state, also feel free to reach out. I can talk to you about how you might be able to do that if one doesn't already exist. But other than that, if there are no more questions, I'm going to stick around for another 5 minutes. You guys are all welcome to sign off, but I'll give it 5 more minutes if anybody wants to hop on and ask any other questions. So Adam, you're asking about, yes. So we are, yes and no. If you send me an email, so a couple of things. Adam's asking about funding for training. So there's skip funding that every state receives. And within that, every agency receives a certain amount of skip funding. So the Safer Communities Act, under the Biden administration, allocated quite a bit of money toward violence prevention, and a big earmark for that was ERPO implementation. So every state structured how they utilize those funds differently. I'm currently working with Rhode Island on a statewide implementation program. Rhode Island is not a very big state, so it's going to be a fun one to work on. It'll be nice to see results quickly. But every state decides how they use that funding. So if you want to look into, or I can look into it with you. The other option that we've done is certain larger agencies will host us. So Denver PD hosted us in Denver and made it a regional training. They invited 36 other officers from 16 neighboring agencies, and we put on the 3-day ERPO BTAM training there. And so they funded it, and then they invited all the neighboring agencies because they saw the value in having everybody trained together and also kind of create that network of practice in the region. So those are a couple of options. If you want to email me your contact, or we can set up a time next week to talk, I'm happy to do that too, and we can put our heads together and figure out a way to make it happen. Okay, great. Thanks, Adam. Great.
Nice work, Chris. This was really done well.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
We'll get with you later about some other things.
I'm excited. I'll be excited to hear about it. All right. Well, with that, again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And I would love to, figure out, Adam, how we can make something happen. I'm from Brooklyn originally. Spent a lot of time upstate New York in the Catskills. My brother went to Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo. He just graduated. He's 10. My dad's second marriage, so he's 20 years younger than me. But any excuse I can get to come up and train in New York, I would love that. So let's see what we can figure out. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe.